Chapter 7 of The Harbor of Doubt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Harbor of Doubt by Frank Williams. Chapter 7. A Stranger. The ensuing week was one such as the village had never beheld. A visitor to the island might have thought that war had been declared, and that a privateering expedition was being fitted out. On the railroad near Flag Point there was always some vessel being scraped or painted. Supplies brought over from St. John's by the steamer Grande Mignon were stowed in lazarets and below. Rigging was overhauled, canvas patched or renewed, and bright, tawny ropes substituted for the old ones in sheet and tackle. Every low tide was a signal for great activity among the vessels made fast alongside the wharfs, for the rise of the water was nearly 20 feet, and when it receded the ships stood upright on their keels and exposed their bottoms to scraper, caulking mallet, and paintbrush. In every house where father or son was expecting soon to sail, the women were busy with clothing and general outfit. There was a run on the store carrying oilskins, sea boots, oil lamps, stoves, and general paraphernalia. All these things were gotten on credit, for there is no such thing as a vessel returning empty-handed from the Banks, and Bill Boughton stood sponsor for most of them. The owners of vessels divided their time between provisioning and overhauling their ships and the securing of crews. One rainy afternoon, when work had been generally suspended, a number of the men gathered inside Bill Boughton's store to wait for a let-up in the downpour, and the subject of crews was broached. "How you comin' with your crew, Bige?" asked a tall, lanky man of Captain Tanner. "First rate. Got a dozen men now, and that's about all the Rosan can take care of. At that, somebody'll have to sleep in a locker, I calculate." "You're doin' well, Bige. I hear Jed Martin can't round up more'n 8, and he's been as far south as Great Harbor." "Do you wonder?" put in a third. "Jed ain't never set up grub that a shark would eat. I sailed with him once 5 year ago, and that was enough for me." "12 men ain't much," put in Tanner. "Them Gloucester men sail with 16 or 18 right along, and I've heard of one feller put out of T Wharf, Boston, carrying 28 dories. Of course them fellers lays to fill up quick and make short trips for the fresh market. Ain't many of them briners." "Don't believe there's anybody'll carry 16 men out of here, is they?" came a voice from over in the corner. "Sure." The rumble and bellow of the reply denoted Pete Ellinwood where he sat on a cracker box, his 6½ feet of length sprawled halfway from one counter to the other. "There's Nat Burns's Hetty B. She'll carry 16, and so will Code Schofield's Laughing Lass, maybe more." "Huh, yes, if he can get 'em," sneered a voice. "Get 'em? Of course he'll get 'em. Why not?" demanded Ellinwood, turning upon the other belligerently. "Well," replied the other, "they do say there's men in this village, and farther south too, that wouldn't sail with Code, not for $1,000 and all fund." "Them that says it are fools," declared Ellinwood. "And liars," cut in Bijonah Tanner hotly. "Why won't they sail with a lad? He can handle a schooner as well as you, Bert, and better." "Yes," said the other contemptuously. "Nobody's ever forgot the way he handled the old May Schofield. Better not play with fire, Bige, or you'll get your hands burned." Pete Ellinwood got upon his feet deliberately. He was the biggest and most powerful man in the village, despite his 45 years, and his ableness in a discussion, physical or otherwise, was universally respected. "Look here, you, Bert, and all the rest of you fellers. I've got something to say. For considerable time now I've heard dirty talk about Code and the May Schofield, Dirty talk and nothing more. Now, if any of you can prove that Code did anything but try and save the old schooner, let's hear you do it. If not, shut up. I don't want to hear no more of that talk." There was silence for a while as all hands sought to escape the gray, accusing eye that wandered slowly around the circle. Then from back in the shadow somewhere a voice said sneeringly, "What axe you got to grind, Pete?" A laugh went around, for it was common talk that, since the death of Jasper Schofield, Pete had expressed his admiration for Ma Schofield in more than one way. "I got this axe to grind, Andrew," replied Ellinwood calmly, "that I'm signed on as mate in the Charming Lass, and I believe the boy is as straight and as good a sailor as anybody on the island." This was news to the crowd, and the men digested it a minute in silence. "How many men ye got sailin' with ye?" asked one who had not spoken before. "5 outside the skipper and me," was the reply, "and I calculate we'll fill her up in a day or so. 7 men can sail her like a witch, but they won't fill her hold very quick. She'll take 1,500 quintal easy, or I judge her wrong." A prolonged whistle from outside interrupted the discussion, and one man going to the door announced that it had stopped raining. All hands got up and prepared to go back to work. Only Bijonah Tanner remained to buy some groceries from Boughton. "Steamer's early today," said the storekeeper, glancing at his watch. "She's bringing me a lot of salt from St. John's, and I guess I can get it into the shed tonight." Having satisfied Tanner, he went out of the store the back way and left the captain alone filling his pipe. A short blast of the whistle told him that the steamer was tied up, and idly he lingered to see who had come to the island. The passengers, to reach the King's Road, were obliged to go past the corner of the general store, and Bijonah stood on the low wooden veranda watching them. Some 24 had gone when his eye was attracted by a pale, thin youth in a light gray suit and Panama hat. He thought nothing of him at first, except to remark his clothes, but as he came within short vision, Tanner gave a grunt of astonishment and bit through the reed stem of his corncob pipe. He recognized the youth as the one he had seen in St. John's, and had referred to as the secretary to the president of the Marine Insurance Company. Instantly the old man's mind flashed back to what he had heard only a week before, which he had told Code. He stood looking after the stranger as though spellbound, his slow mind groping vainly for some explanation of his presence in Freekirk Head. He felt instinctively that it must be in connection with the case of Code Schofield and the May, and his feeling was corroborated a moment later when, from behind the trunk of a big pine tree, Nat Burns stepped forward and greeted the other. They had apparently met before, for they shook hands cordially and continued westward along the King's Road. A few steps brought them opposite the gate to the Schofield cottage, and Bijonah, following their motions like a hawk, saw Nat jerk his thumb in the direction of the house as they walked past. That was enough for Tanner. He was convinced now that the insurance man had come to carry out the threat made in St. John's, and that Nat Burns was more intimately connected with the scheme than he had at first supposed. Bijonah set down his package of groceries on the counter inside and turned away toward the wharf, where the Charming Lass was tied up for a final trimming. She already had her salt aboard and most of her provisions and was being given her final touches by Pete Ellinwood, Jimmy Thomas, and the other members of the crew that had signed on to sail in her. Tanner hailed Ellinwood from the wharf and beckoned so frantically that the big man swarmed up the rigging to the dock as though he were going aloft to reef a topsail in a half a gale. "Code's in a pile of trouble," said the old man, and went on briefly to narrate the whole circumstance of the insurance company's possible move. That feller came on the steamer this afternoon, and if he serves Code with the summons or attachment or whatever it is, it's my idea that the Lass will never round the Swallowtail for the Banks. Where is the boy?" "Went up to Castalia to see a couple of men who he thought he might get for the crew, but I don't think Burns or anyone else knows it. He wanted to make the trip on the quiet, and get them without anybody's knowing it if he could. But what do you calculate to do, Bige?" "By the great snood, I don't know," declared Tanner helplessly. "Well," said Pete reassuringly, "you just let me handle this little trouble myself. We'll have the skipper safe and clear if we have to commit murder to do it. Now, Bige, you just keep your mouth shut and don't worry no more. I'll do the rest." Feeling the responsibility to be in capable hands, and secretly glad to escape events that might be too much for his years, Captain Tanner walked back to the road, secured his package of groceries at the store, and made his way home to the Widow Sprague's house. For 5 minutes Pete Ellinwood lounged indolently against a spile, engrossed in thought. Then he put on his coat and crossed the King's Road to the Schofield cottage. He had hardly opened the gate when a strange youth in a gray suit and Panama hat came out of the front door and down the path. Pete recognized the newcomer from St. John's, and the newcomer evidently recognized him. "Ha! Captain Code Schofield, I presume," he announced, thrusting his hands nervously into his pocket and bringing out a fistful of papers. So eager and excited was he that, unnoticed, he dropped one flimsy sheet, many times folded, into the grass. "No, I'm not Schofield," rumbled Ellinwood from the depths of his mighty chest. "Get along with you now." "Please accept service of this paper, Captain Schofield," said the other, extending a legal-looking document, and shrugging his shoulders as though to say that Pete's denial of identity was, of course, only natural, but could hardly be indulged. "I'm not Schofield," bellowed Pete, outraged. "My name's Ellinwood, and anybody'll tell you so. I won't take your derned paper. If you want Schofield, find him." The young man drew back, nonplussed, but might have continued his attentions had not a passer-by come to Pete's rescue and sworn to his identity. Only then did the young lawyer, for he was that as well as private secretary, withdraw with short and grudged apologies. Pete, growling to himself like a great bear, was starting forward to the house when his eye was caught by the folded paper that had dropped from the packet in the lawyer's hand. He stooped, picked it up, and, with a glance about, to prove that the other was out of sight, opened it. As he read it, his eyes widened and his jaw dropped with astonishment. Twice he slowly spelled out the words before him, and then, with a low whistle and a gigantic wink, thrust the paper carefully into his pocket and pinned the pocket. "That will be news to the lad, sure enough," he said, continuing on his way toward the house. The little orphan girl Josie admitted him. He found Mrs. Schofield on the verge of tears. She had just been through a long and painful interview with the newcomer, and had barely recovered from the shock of what he had to tell. Code, since learning of what was in the air, had not told his mother, for he did not wish to alarm her unnecessarily, and was confident he would get away to the Banks before the slow-moving St. John firm took action. Pete, smitten mightily by the distress of the calmly middle-aged widow, melted to a misery of unexpressible tenderness and solicitude. In his words and actions of comfort he resembled a great, loving St. Bernard dog who had accidentally knocked down a toddling child and is desirous of making amends. Ma Schofield took note of his desire to lighten her burden, and presently permitted it to be lightened. Then they talked over the situation, and Pete finally said, I'm sending Jimmy Thomas down to Castalia in his motor dory to find Code. Of course, the skipper took his own dory, and we may meet him coming back. What we want to do is head him off and keep him away from here. Now, there's no tellin' how long he might have to stay away, and I've been figuring that perhaps if you was to take him a bundle of clothes it wouldn't go amiss." "I'll do it," announced Ma sturdily. "Just you tell Jimmy to wait a quarter of an hour and I'll be along. Now, Pete Ellinwood, listen here. What scheme have you got in your mind? I can see by your eyes that there is one." "May!" cried Pete reproachfully. "How could I have anything in my mind without telling you?" Nevertheless, when he walked out of the cottage door, it was to chuckle enormously in his black beard and call himself names that he had to deceive May. He called Jimmy Thomas up from the duties of the paint pot and brush, and gave him instructions as to what to do. They talked rapidly in low tones until Mrs. Schofield appeared. Then Jimmy helped her into the motor dory and both men pushed off. "I calculate I'll have it all worked out when you come back, Jim," said Pete, as the engine caught the spark and the dory moved away. Mrs. Schofield turned around and fixed her sharp blue eyes upon the giant ashore. "Peter," she cried, "I knew there was some scheme. When I get back—" But the rest was lost, for distance had overcome her voice. Ellinwood stood and grinned benignly at his goddess. Then he slapped his thigh with an 11-inch hand and made a noise with his mouth like a man clucking to his horse. "Sprightly as a gal, she is," he allowed. "Dummed if she ain't." Chapter 7. Recording by Roger Moline.